Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be back.
Today, we're tackling a massive topic. We're really looking at the operating system of the American economy.
The source code.
Exactly. You know, we often look around at the business world today, the endless layoffs, this obsession with quarterly stock prices, the massive gap between CEO and worker pay, and we just sort of assume
That this is just the way it is.
right. We assume, well, that's just how capitalism works. That's the natural law of the market.
We perceive it as gravity, just a fundamental force of nature that we all have to live with.
But the book we're diving into today makes a really powerful argument that it is not gravity. It's software. It was code that was written at a specific time by a specific group of people and really popularized by one man in particular.
And that book is The Man Who Broke Capitalism by David Welch.
We're doing a full deep dive on this one.
And this book is just fascinating because it's not really a biography in the traditional sense. It uses the story of Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of General Electric, as a lens.
A lens to examine a much bigger systemic shift.
That's it. So the central inquiry we're going to explore today is this. How did the American economic operating system shift from a model of, let's say, long-term institutional stability, what we might call stakeholder capitalism, to one of brutal, short-term shareholder extraction?
And it's so crucial to say this right up front. This isn't just about General Electric. It's not just a story about one company that sold toasters or, jet engines.
No. This is about the source code change for the entire Fortune 500.
It's about a change in the very definition of what a corporation is for.
That's the key. We really need to look at this as a case study in how a specific management ideology, let's call it Welchism for our purposes, became a kind of self-replicating system, a virus almost.
And that ideology explains so much about our current world. It explains why we see companies prioritize stock prices over the quality of their own products, and how this word efficiency became a proxy for good, even when the things it led to were, objectively destructive.
Right. Even when it destroyed long-term value, communities, and even lives.
And before we get into the real heavy stuff, let's just clarify our lens for this deep dive. We are not here to judge Jack Welch, the human being. We're not going to gossip about his personal life or his famous temper.
No, that's not the point. We are looking strictly at structures and incentives.
That's our focus. We want to understand the mechanisms that Welch installed, the rules of the game that rewarded specific behaviors and punished others, and how those rules eventually reshaped the entire global economy.
Because if you really want to understand why, a door plug might fly off a Boeing jet at 16,000 feet, or why the middle class feels so hollowed out, you have to understand the machine that Jack Welch built.
So let's set the stage. Let's provide some context. Who is David Welch, and why did he feel compelled to write this book now?
So David Welch is a business reporter for the New York Times. He spent years on the beat covering corporate power, finance, CEOs. He's seen this world from the inside.
He's not an outsider lobbing critiques. He's been in the room.
Exactly. And he wrote this book in the wake of two really major seismic events. First, the complete collapse of General Electric, which was once the most valuable and admired company in the world. And second, the Boeing 737 MX crashes.
And we are definitely going to connect those dots later, because the through line from GE's boardroom to those Boeing crashes is direct and, frankly, chilling. But Welch was essentially asking the question, how did we get here?
Right. How did these titanic American institutions, these pillars of industry, lose their way so catastrophically?
To answer that, you have to go back. You have to understand the before state. What did the world look like before Jack Welch took the helm at GE in 1981?
We have to talk about Generous Electric.
I love that phrase. It sounds so quaint. Generous Electric, like some kind of made-up corporate utopia. But this was real, right? In the 1950s.
It was very real. If you go back and you actually read GE's 1953 annual report, and Jill describes this in the book, it is just mind-blowing by today's standards. The company actually bragged about how much they paid their workers in wages.
They bragged about their payroll.
And not just that, they bragged about how much they paid in taxes.
Wait, hold on. They were boasting about paying taxes. I mean, today, the entire game is to pay as close to zero as legally possible. You have these massive companies like Apple, Amazon. They employ armies of lawyers to minimize their tax exposure.
And they celebrate it as a sign of smart management.
So you're saying GE used to highlight paying taxes as a civic good, a point of pride.
Exactly. It was seen as their contribution to the society that allowed them to thrive. In 1953, GE stated that about 37 cents of every dollar of sales went to pay and benefits for their employees. They had illustrations in the report of happy workers holding like bags of money.
It's cartoonish, but it tells you what they value.
It tells you everything. And when they listed their stakeholders, their responsibilities, they listed shareholders last.
Last. That.
Yeah.
That seems almost legally distinct from how companies operate now. I mean,
Yeah.
we're all taught there's this fiduciary duty to put shareholders first, above all else.
Well, that specific interpretation of fiduciary duty is actually a much more modern legal evolution, one that Welch himself helped popularize. Back then, the prevailing philosophy was what they called the three-legged stool.
Okay, what's that?
You have customers, you have employees, and you have shareholders. And the job of a good manager, a good CEO, was to keep those three legs in balance.
So not to prioritize one over the others.
Right. The idea was that they were all interconnected. It was a virtuous cycle. If you treat your employees well and pay them fairly, they'll be motivated to make good products. If you make good products, your customers will be happy and loyal.
And if your customers are happy, the company makes money.
And the shareholders get a fair, steady return on their investment. It was about creating stable, long-term value for everyone, an equilibrium.
And the economic data from that period backs this up, doesn't it? The link between productivity and wages.
It tracks almost perfectly. From the end of World War II up until the late 1970s, as companies became more efficient and more profitable, workers saw their paychecks go up by almost the exact same amount.
The gains were shared.
They were, and CEOs in this era were, well, they were essentially stewards. They were administrators. They were not the rock star celebrities we see today. They saw their job as managing the institution for the long haul.
I think the book mentions Reg Jones, who was the CEO right before Welch. He was considered the most respected business leader in America.
He was, and he lived in a simple, brick colonial home. He wasn't living in some mega mansion. He made about $200,000 a year.
Which was good money, obviously.
It was great money for the time, but it was about 12 to 13 times what a new management recruit at GE would make.
Okay, let's just put a pin in that number, a ratio of 12 or 13 to 1. Because that ratio is going to, it's going to explode later in our story.
It's going to become unrecognizable.
So we have this post-war golden age of capitalism. Sounds pretty good, balanced, stable. But obviously, something broke. The system changed. Why? Was it just greed?
It wasn't just greed, it was fear. The 1970s happened, and economically, the 70s were a disaster. We hit this thing called stagflation.
Right. That's a nightmare scenario for economists.
It's the worst of both worlds. You have high inflation, so prices are going up everywhere, but you have low economic growth. Your paycheck is buying less, and the whole economy is stuck in the mud.
And at the same time, American companies were facing a new threat.
For the first time, really, serious global competition. You had Japanese companies like Honda and Sony rising, and they were making better products, more reliable products, and often they were making them cheaper.
So this created a deep anxiety in American boardrooms. The Queen Mary, which is what Reg Jones called GE, suddenly felt very slow. It felt bloated and complacent.
Precisely. The system was primed for revolution. And intellectually, the ground was shifting too. This is really important. In 1970, the famous economist Milton Friedman published a landmark essay in the New York Times Magazine.
The Friedman Doctrine.
Yes. And he argued, very forcefully, that the only social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. Full stop.
So just throw out the three-legged stool, kick two of the legs out. It's just one leg now.
It is just one leg,
Cool.
the shareholder. Friedman argued that if a CEO spends money worrying about the community or the environment or paying workers more than the bare minimum required by the market, they are essentially stealing from the shareholders.
They're spending someone else's money on their own pet social projects.
That was his argument. And it was a radical fringe idea in 1970. But by 1981, with the economy stalling and the fear of foreign competition rising, the business world was hungry for a new model. They were ready for someone to take that abstract theory and put it into brutal, effective practice.
Enter Jack Welch.
Patient zero of the shareholder value movement.
Okay, so let's unpack the system that he built. This is our core systems analysis. We've identified about 5 key insights from the book that really explain how Welchism works as a machine. And the first one, the foundational one, is this explicit shift to shareholder primacy.
This is the bedrock. Everything else is built on this. When Welch took over GE, he stood up and explicitly stated that his goal was to make GE the most valuable company on earth.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate for a second. That sounds Well, it sounds like a perfectly reasonable goal for a CEO, doesn't it? Isn't that their job, to make the company valuable?
On the surface, of course. But the devil is in the details of how you measure value. It changed the primary metric of success.
How so?
Before Welch, success might have been defined by, longevity or the quality of your engineering or your market share or the stability you provided your community. Welch changed the single overriding metric to quarterly earnings per share, or EPS,
It's the stock price.
and more specifically the stock price over the next 90 days.
And when you change the metric, you change the behavior.
You change everything. This is a fundamental concept in systems thinking. It's sometimes called Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Meaning people will just gain the number instead of improving the underlying reality.
Exactly. If your single goal is the quarterly stock price, then every single decision in the company gets filtered through one question. Will this boost the stock in the next 90 days? Not, will this make a better jet engine in 10 years?
It fundamentally shrinks the time horizon. You stop looking at the horizon and you start staring at the speedometer right in front of your face.
That is a perfect analogy. And that obsessive focus on the speedometer brings us directly to the second insight. And this is where the human cost becomes very, very real. Downsizing as a signaling mechanism. We have to talk about neutron jack.
Right, neutron jack. The nickname itself is just chilling. It refers to the neutron bomb, which was a weapon designed to kill all the people but leave the building standing.
That's how his own workforce saw him.
So what did he do to earn that name?
In his first few years as CEO, he laid off over 100,000 workers. 100,000 people.
But here's the part that is so hard to grasp from our modern perspective, or rather from the pre-Welch perspective. Usually, layoffs are a sign of trouble, right? It's a company saying, oh no, we're going under, we have to cut costs to survive.
Exactly. Traditionally, a big layoff was an admission of failure by management. It was a white flag. It said, we messed up, we overhired, or we can't sell our product, and now good people have to pay the price.
But Welch, he flipped that script completely.
He turned it on its head. Because he executed these mass firings when General Electric was still highly profitable.
So they were making money. This wasn't about survival.
Not at all. They were making money, but in his view, they weren't making enough money. The margins weren't high enough to satisfy this new, voracious hunger for efficiency and a higher stock price.
That was the taboo he broke then. He decoupled layoffs from corporate distress.
He turned layoffs into a strategic tool. He weaponized them. It became a signaling mechanism to Wall Street. He wanted to show the analysts and the big investors that he was tough, that he was willing to make the hard calls to extract more profit.
And Wall Street's reaction.
They absolutely loved
That's the perversity of the feedback loop, isn't it? He fires 10,000 people, their lives are turned upside down, a community is devastated, and the stock price jumps.
It created this incredibly powerful, almost Pavlovian response in the market. Wall Street began to reward the destruction of labor capital.
What do you mean by labor capital?
The skills, the experience, the institutional knowledge of your workforce, it's a real asset. But Welch's system taught the market to see it as a liability. If you fired thousands of people, your margins looked better for that quarter because your payroll cost dropped immediately.
Instant gratification on the balance sheet.
The stock went up, and you, the CEO, who is now being paid mostly in stock options, got instantly richer. It created this template. It signaled to every other CEO in America, if you want your stock to pop, fire your workers. Wall Street will reward you for it.
It normalized seeing human beings purely as a cost on a spreadsheet, a number to be minimized. But surely there's a limit to that. I mean, you still need people to actually make the stuff.
Well, that's where the logic leads, and it takes us directly to our third key insight, financialization. Because Welch had this realization. He realized that bending metal, actually making physical things like turbines and refrigerators and light bulbs is hard.
It's messy.
It's messy, it's labor-intensive, it requires factories and safety regulations and unions and R&D. And at the end of the day, the profit margins are often pretty thin. So if your goal is infinite, smooth, predictable growth, where do you go?
You go where the money is, where the money moves fast.
You go to finance. You move money around. So Welch systematically transformed GE from a premier industrial manufacturer into, for all intents and purposes, a massive, unregulated bank.
GE Capital.
He took GE Capital, which had been this small, sleepy division that mostly just financed people's appliance purchases, and he turned it into a behemoth, a financial empire.
This is the part of the story that always just blows my mind. Because I grew up thinking GE made dishwashers and MRI machines. I had no idea they were basically a giant hedge fund in disguise. How did this actually work mechanically?
It was, at its core, an arbitrage play. See, GE, the industrial giant, had a AAA credit rating.
The highest possible rating. Rock solid.
The best you can get. That meant they could borrow money on the open market very, very cheaply. Cheaper than almost any actual bank.
So they have access to a fire hose of cheap cash.
Exactly. So they would borrow billions of dollars at, say, 2% interest. And then, through GE Capital, they would lend that money out to other people, to businesses for commercial real estate, to consumers through credit cards. They even got into subprime mortgages at much higher rates.
So they just pocket the difference.
They captured the spread. They got into everything.
Yeah.
Insurance, leasing fleets of airplanes, financing private equity deals. Moving money became more profitable than making things.
It sounds incredibly profitable, but also incredibly risky.
It was wildly profitable and wildly risky. By the end of the Welch era, somewhere between 40 and even up to 60% of GE's total profit wasn't coming from making things. It was coming from these financial bets.
So the success of the company became fundamentally decoupled from the quality of its actual products.
That is the absolute key takeaway of this phase. You could have a year where your appliance division wasn't selling well, or your jet engine division had a production delay. In a normal manufacturing company, you'd have to report a bad quarter. Your stock would drop.
But GE had a secret weapon.
They had GE Capital, which allowed them to basically cheat the physics of normal business.
Which leads perfectly into our fourth insight, the black box and earnings smoothing.
This is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, gets into a very gray area, legally and ethically. For nearly 20 straight years, GE hit its analyst estimates, the exact profit numbers that Wall Street expected them to hit, for almost 80 quarters in a row.
80 quarters. That's 20 years of perfect, predictable growth. I mean, that's statistically impossible in a normal business, isn't it?
It is. It just doesn't happen.
Real business is messy. Costs fluctuate. A key supplier goes bankrupt. A new competitor emerges. Sales go up and down.
It is statistically impossible for a real industrial company to be that consistent. But because GE Capital was this giant, opaque black box of complicated financial assets, Welch and his team could essentially manage the earnings. The technical term for it is earnings smoothing.
What's the actual mechanism? Can you walk us through what would happen at the end of a quarter?
Okay, so let's say it's 2 days before the quarter ends. The numbers are coming in from the industrial side of GE, the side making light bulbs and CT scanners, and they're short. They promised Wall Street they'd make earnings of, say, 50 cents per share, but the real business is only on track to deliver 49 cents.
Just a penny short.
A penny short is a total disaster in this system. It means you missed, the stock would tank, the magic would be gone. So Welch's team would get on the phone to the wizards at GE Capital and say, "We need a penny. What do we have?"
And what would they have?
They might say, "Well, we own a portfolio of office buildings in Tokyo and they've appreciated in value. We can sell one of them today." Or, "We have a big reinsurance deal that was supposed to close next week. We can pull it forward and close it today."
So they either sell an asset or pull revenue from the future, just to plug that tiny gap in the present.
They would book that one-time gain from the sale immediately, plug the hole in the budget, and boom, they hit the number.
Exactly.
50 cents on the nose.
It created this complete illusion of supernatural consistency.
And investors called it the GE premium. They were willing to pay more for GE stock because they thought, wow, this guy Welch is a magician. He's a genius. He delivers every single time. But it wasn't magic.
It was financial engineering.
It was accounting alchemy, and it shaped the perception of the company, hiding the enormous volatility and risk that was actually building up under the surface. They were borrowing from the future to make the present look perfect.
And while he was doing all this financial wizardry at the top to please the bankers, down on the factory floor and in the offices, he instituted a management system that brings us to our fifth and final insight: rank and yank.
Or as Welch called it, the vitality curve.
It sounds so healthy, doesn't it? Vitality, like a vitamin supplement or something. But in practice?
In practice, it was brutal. It was social Darwinism applied to the modern office.
What were the rules?
The system mandated that every manager in every division every year had to rank their employees on a curve. The top 20% were the A players. They were the stars. They got all the bonuses and the stock options. The middle 70% were the B players. They were deemed adequate. They were kept around, told to work harder to become A's. But the bottom 10%,
The C plays.
they had to go. They were fired every single year.
regardless of their actual performance.
This is the absolutely crucial part to understand. It was regardless of absolute performance, even if the company had a record year. Even if that specific team, say a team of engineers, met all its goals and exceeded them. Even if every single person in that bottom 10% was actually performing well compared to the industry standard, the math of the curve required a sacrifice.
So let me just process this. Imagine you're on a team of 10 brilliant engineers. You're all doing great work. By any objective measure, you're all A players. But this system says, no matter what, one of you has to be labeled a failure and fired this year.
Think about the game theory of that. Think about what that does to a culture. It absolutely destroyed psychological safety.
It turns teammates into competitors.
You're direct competitors for survival. If I help you with your project and you get better, your success might push me down into that bottom 10%. So I have a direct incentive not to help you. I might even have an incentive to sabotage you.
You're certainly not going to raise your hand and mention a mistake you made.
Never. Because that goes on your permanent record for the next ranking session. It creates a culture of fear, of silence, and of hyper-compliance.
What do you mean by hyper-compliance?
You don't question the boss. You don't raise uncomfortable truths like a potential safety concern. You don't innovate in a risky way. You just focus on hitting your individual metrics so you can survive the next call. You spend all your energy managing up, not managing the work. It rewards politicking over performance.
Okay, let's pause here and do what we promised. Let's explicitly draw out the systems map. To really understand how this machine sustained itself, we need to look at all the actors, the incentives, and the narratives that held it all together.
Right, because this isn't just about one guy being a tough boss. It's about an entire ecosystem that he created.
So let's start with the actors. At the center of the web, you have the CEO.
And Welch completely transformed this role. It used to be a steward, an administrator, the mayor of the large town. He turned it into the rock star celebrity CEO, the singular genius who creates all the value.
Then you have the analyst class on Wall Street.
They were the gatekeepers, the scorekeepers. They were the ones who demanded the smooth, predictable rising earnings. They created and enforced the beat and raise game. If you beat their estimate, you were a hero. If you missed by a single penny, your stock was punished severely.
So the pressure on the CEO from that quarter was just immense.
Constant, every 90 days. Then you have the shareholders themselves.
And they were changing too.
Radically. They shifted from being long-term holders, people who bought GE stock for the dividend and planned to hold it for 30 years to fund their retirement, to being short-term traders, hedge funds, people demanding an immediate pop in the price. The average holding period for a stock plummeted during this era.
And finally, the last actor in this system, the employees.
They were transformed from being seen as assets to be developed into costs to be minimized. They became liabilities on the balance sheet.
Okay, so those are the players. Now, what's the engine driving this whole system? The incentives. We touched on this, but let's be absolutely explicit about the fuel source. Stock options.
This is the single most important structural change that powered the whole machine. Before Welch, most CEOs were paid in salary and maybe a cash bonus. Welch absolutely exploded the use of stock options for executives.
Can you just quickly explain the mechanism of a stock option for anyone who might not know?
Sure. A stock option gives you the right, but not the obligation, to buy your company's stock at a set price called the strike price at some point in the future.
So if the stock price goes up, way above that strike price,
your option is suddenly worth millions. You can buy the stock at the old cheap price and immediately sell it at the new high price. If the stock price stays flat or goes down, your option is worthless.
So it directly and powerfully aligns the CEO's personal wealth with the stock price.
Entirely. And critically, with the short-term stock price. If I can do something today to make the stock go up, like fire 10,000 people or announce a massive stock buyback, I make millions of dollars personally right now.
Whereas if you invest in a long-term R&D project, that might pay off in 10 years.
Well, I might be retired by then. The options might have expired. The incentive is overwhelmingly biased toward short-term action.
It's the quarterly shot clock. You are living your professional life in these 90-day increments.
And this forces those damaging short-term decisions. You cut the R&D budget. You delay expensive but necessary maintenance on the factory. You squeeze your suppliers for every last penny. It all looks great on the balance sheet for this quarter, but you are hollowing out the company's future.
You're eating the seed corn to make this quarter's meal bigger.
A perfect metaphor. Then you have the narratives, the software, the stories that hold it all together and justify the behavior.
We hear these words all the time, even today. Efficiency, competitiveness, meritocracy.
They are incredibly powerful, almost unarguable words. They act as a moral shield. Who can possibly be against efficiency? Who doesn't want a meritocracy?
But you're saying in this system, those words were code.
They were code. Efficiency was code for firing people to boost quarterly margins. Competitiveness was code for crushing unions and outsourcing jobs. And meritocracy was the narrative used to justify the brutal zero-sum game of rank and yank. It gave a moral veneer to what was, at its core, ruthless extraction.
And finally, let's talk about the feedback loops that made the system so resilient and self-perpetuating.
There are two big ones. First is what you could call the doom loop of layoffs. A company announces massive layoffs. The market perceives this as a sign of tough management, so the stock price jumps. The CEO, rich with stock options, gets even richer. Other CEOs at other companies see this happen.
They want that same stock bump.
So they imitate the behavior. They announce their own layoffs, whether they're needed or not. And soon, layoffs become a completely normalized, accepted part of the corporate playbook across the entire economy. The loop reinforces itself.
And the second loop.
The imitation loop. Because GE's stock was so high for so long, everyone just assumed that Welchism was the correct way to run a business. Harvard Business School wrote glowing case studies about it.
It became the gospel.
It did. And then GE executives, all trained in this system, were hired away to become CEOs of other major companies, Boeing, Home Depot, 3M, Chrysler. They were seen as the best managers in the world, and they took the Welch's virus with them and spread it throughout the corporate world.
It's a classic case of what systems thinkers call success to the successful. Because it appeared to work for the stock price in the short term, it just kept reinforcing the behavior, even as it was degrading the underlying health of the company and the economy. I want to bring in some of the specific quotes from the book now, because they really anchor these abstract concepts in cold, hard reality. And the first one is that famous exchange, the passing of the torch from Red Jones to Jack Welch.
Ah, yes. Jones, the old steward, handing over the keys.
So Red Jones has built this stable, respected institution. He hands it over to Welch and says essentially, Jack, I'm giving you the Queen Mary. This ship is designed not to sink. And what does Welch say back?
He snaps back instantly. I don't want the Queen Mary. I plan to blow up the Queen Mary. I want speedboats.
I plan to blow up the Queen Mary. I mean, that is such a violent, aggressive image for a new CEO taking over a wildly successful company.
It tells you everything about the shift in mindset. It's a total, utter rejection of institutional stability. The system is no longer about safety or legacy or smooth sailing for the next generation.
It's about agility.
It's about agility, fragmentation, and rapid, constant direction changes to chase quarterly profit. He literally wanted to break the company into smaller, more disposable pieces, speedboats, that could be maneuvered and bought and sold quickly.
And that leads directly to the second quote, which became his mantra for every single one of those business units. Fix it, close it, or sell it.
That was the rule. Any GE division that wasn't number 1 or number 2 in its global market had to be fixed immediately, closed down, or sold off.
From a systems perspective, what does that mantra tell us?
It represents the complete commoditization of the corporation. A business unit, say the division that's been making coasters in a small town for 80 years, is no longer viewed as a community of workers or a tradition of quality craftsmanship. It is purely a financial asset on a spreadsheet.
And if it doesn't yield the absolute maximum rate of extraction,
You discard it. You don't nurture it. You don't invest in it for the long term. You strip it for parts or sell it to the highest bidder. It incentivizes short-term value extraction over the hard work of fixing complex problems.
the book makes a direct connection from this mindset to a more modern example.
Yeah.
Kraft Heinz and the 3G Capital model, right?
Yes, this is a perfect real-world anchor. 3G Capital is a private equity firm that is a modern-day descendant of the Welchist philosophy. They bought these iconic, beloved American brands like Kraft and Heinz, and they applied this exact sell it or squeeze it mindset.
They used a method called zero-based budgeting.
That's right. It sounds prudent and responsible on the surface, but it means that every single expense, from paper clips to R&D, has to be justified from scratch every single year.
And in practice, what did that lead to?
In practice, it meant slashing costs to the absolute bone. They laid off tens of thousands of people, they closed historic factories, and they completely stopped innovating. They treated these century-old brands like a lemon that just needed to be squeezed as hard as possible.
And what was the long-term result?
The brands began to erode. You can only squeeze a lemon so hard before you run out of juice. They extracted a ton of cash in the short term, but they destroyed the long-term health and value of the brands. Customers noticed the quality dropped, new competitors emerged that they couldn't respond to, and the stock eventually crashed because there was no there anymore. It was a hollowed-out shell.
And the third quote is just one word, really, but it's a word Welch used constantly: differentiation.
This was his preferred clinical-sounding euphemism for the rank and yank system. He would argue that it was false kindness to keep people on the payroll who weren't the absolute best. He said, differentiation is how winning teams work.
But when you look at that word through a systems lens,
It exposes the intentional engineering of a scarcity mindset into the workforce. It frames employment not as a collaborative enterprise, but as a brutal zero-sum game. Your survival depends not on the team's success, but on you personally outcompeting your colleagues.
and the book makes a chilling and incredibly important connection from this cultural mindset to the tragedies at Boeing.
The Boeing connection is heavy. We really need to unpack this carefully because it shows the real-world life and death consequences of this system.
So how does a management philosophy like rank and yank lead to a plane crash?
Yeah.
What's the causal chain?
It's all about the slow, steady erosion of culture. When Welch's disciples, specifically CEOs Harry Stonecipher and later James McNerney, took over Boeing, they imported the GE playbook wholesale. Now, you have to understand, Boeing used to be a company run by engineers.
Their whole identity was about engineering excellence. Safety first.
Their motto was effectively, safety is paramount. But under the Welch disciples, one of the first things they did was move the corporate headquarters from Seattle, where the planes were actually being designed and built, to Chicago.
Physically separating the financial decision makers from the engineers on the ground.
It was a deeply symbolic and practical move. The culture shifted from one of engineering prowess to one of financial metrics, and they instituted rank and yank. Now imagine you are a mid-level engineer working on the software for the 737 MAX, the MCA system. You see a problem, you have a safety concern.
Okay.
But you know that the corporate culture punishes people who are difficult. You know that slowing down production or raising costs could land you in that bottom 10% at the next review. And you know that the bottom 10% get fired, no questions asked.
So you stay quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Or you tell yourself it's probably not that big a deal, and you assume someone else, someone higher up, will catch it.
You stay quiet. Or you cut a corner to hit an aggressive deadline. The incentive structure of the system prioritized hitting the schedule and the cost target above all else. And we know the tragic result of that. 2 brand new planes fell out of the sky. Hundreds of lives were lost.
That is the ultimate horrifying cost of this software. It's not just numbers on a quarterly report. It's planes falling out of the sky.
That is the crisis in perception in its starkest form. We perceive the rising stock price and the on-time delivery as success, but the hidden reality is a hollowed-out, fearful engineering culture that kills people.
So let's zoom out and talk about the broader present-day implications.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jack Welch is gone, but as the book argues, we are all still living in his world. It talks about the GE diaspora.
Yes, the viral spread. It's astonishing. At one point, 16 major public companies were being run by men who had trained directly under Welch at GE, Home Depot, Chrysler, Boeing, 3M, Honeywell. The list goes on.
And the pattern when they took over was always the same.
It was remarkably, almost robotically consistent. They would be hired with great fanfare. The GE magic is coming to our company. The stock would pop initially, just on the news, and then they would open the playbook and run the same plays.
Cut costs, fire people, buy back stock.
Cut costs, fire people, buy back stock, and financialize the business.
Let's look at the Home Depot example with CEO Bob Nardelli.
A classic textbook case. Nardelli takes over Home Depot. Now you have to understand, Home Depot's unique competitive advantage, their secret sauce, was their staff. Their floor staff were often retired plumbers, electricians, carpenters. They were experts who could actually help you figure out how to fix your leaky sink.
Right. That's why you went there instead of some generic hardware store. You were paying for that expertise.
That was the entire value proposition. But Nardelli, coming from the GE system, looked at that expert staff and he saw one thing: high labor costs. So he systematically replaced the experienced full-time experts with cheaper part-time workers who didn't know anything. He centralized purchasing. He pumped the short-term numbers.
But the customer experience collapsed.
It fell off a cliff. People stopped going because the soul of the company, the reason for its existence, had been gutted to feed the quarterly metrics. Nardelli was eventually ousted, but he walked away with a severance package of over $200 million.
While the employees and the customers were left to deal with the fallout.
That's the Welch's model in a nutshell.
And then there's the macroeconomic data, the staggering rise in inequality.
The book cites this one devastating statistic that just says it all. Since 1978, which is roughly the start of this era, CEO compensation adjusted for inflation has grown by 940%.
940%. It's a number that's so big it's hard to even comprehend.
And over that same period, what about the wages for the typical worker? They've grown by just 12%.
Wow. Laying those two numbers side by side really paints the entire picture.
That great divorce between productivity and pay is a direct output of the Welchist operating system. If you perceive labor purely as a cost to be minimized and you perceive the CEO as the singular creator of all value to be maximized, this is the mathematical result you get. It's not an accident, it's the design intent of the system.
We also have to talk about the idea of hollowed-out institutions. We saw this play out so clearly in the crises of 2008 and again in 2020.
This is a critical point. The obsession with financial engineering specifically, spending billions and billions of dollars on stock buybacks, drained the cash reserves of these massive corporations. For years, they spent almost all of their profits buying their own stock to artificially boost the price and trigger executive bonuses.
So when a real crisis hit, like the 2008 financial crash or the COVID-19 pandemic, they had no buffer. They had no resilience. They had no cash for a rainy day.
They were incredibly fragile, so they immediately came to the government, to the taxpayer, with their hands out. Bail us out, or the whole economy goes down.
It's the classic formula. Privatize gains, socialize losses.
It is the ultimate feature of the system, not a bug. They extract all the value in cash in the good times, and the public is forced to cover the risk and absorb the losses in the bad times.
Now, in 2019, something interesting happened. The Business Roundtable, this big influential club of top CEOs, they came out with a huge public statement. And they said, essentially, we were wrong, we're pivoting, we're going back to stakeholder capitalism, we promise to care about customers, employees, and communities again.
It was a very nice press release, got a lot of good headlines.
I can hear the skepticism in your voice.
The book is, and I think we should be, deeply skeptical. Because you have to look past the words and look at the incentives. Have they fundamentally changed the way CEOs are paid?
No.
Are top executives still paid overwhelmingly in stock options that are tied to short-term performance?
Yes.
Do the Wall Street analysts still demand those relentless quarterly beat-and-raise cycles?
Yes. So it's just talk.
It's Welchism without Welch.
Yeah.
The operating system is still running the same old code. You can't change the behavior if you don't change the incentives that drive the behavior. Until we change how we measure success and how we compensate leaders, the underlying behavior won't fundamentally shift.
And this brings us right back to the core theme of this entire show, crisis in perception.
Absolutely. Because we have to move beyond blaming individuals. It is so easy, and in some ways so satisfying, to look at Jack Welch, the man, his infamous temper, his personal failings, his greed, and just say he was a bad guy. But that misses the entire point.
Because he didn't just act, he built a machine.
He built a machine that compelled everyone else to act that way just to survive. If you were a CDO in the 1990s and you didn't act like Welch, if you invested for the long term, if you refused to do mass layoffs to pump the stock, your board of directors would fire you and hire someone who would. The system selects for Welchism.
And that system fundamentally reshapes our perception of what a good company even is.
Right. We are trained to perceive a company with a constantly rising stock price as a good, successful company. Even if, behind the scenes, it's dumping toxic chemicals into a river, which GE did for decades with PCBs in the Hudson. Even if it's systematically defrauding the government, which GE was caught doing multiple times. Even if it's crushing the soul of its workforce, the financial map completely replaced the actual territory.
And we perceive the decline in the American middle class as this mysterious, unavoidable force. We say, oh, it's globalization, or oh, it's automation and technology.
But the book argues very powerfully that it was a deliberate corporate design choice. It was a choice to view your own workers as a liability to be shed, rather than a partner in creating value.
So as we start to wrap this up, let's reflect on what this book helps us see differently. First, it helps us see capitalism itself in a new light.
It helps us see that the version of capitalism we have today is not a fixed, immutable law of nature. It's a set of rules. And those rules were fundamentally rewritten in the early 1980s. And if they were rewritten then, it means they can be rewritten again.
It also forces us to redefine leadership.
It poses a really profound question. Is a great leader someone who extracts the maximum possible value in a 20-year period and leaves behind a hollowed-out husk? Because we have to remember, GE, the company Welch built his legend on, effectively collapsed shortly after he left. It was strip-mined.
Or is a great leader someone who leaves the institution, the community, and the employees stronger and more resilient than they found them?
It's a fundamental choice about what we value.
We are, in so many ways, living in the wreckage of Jack Welch's world. From the gig economy, which is the ultimate expression of flexible, disposable labor, to the deep financial fragility of our most important corporations.
And so the open question, the provocative thought for you, the listener, is this. If shareholder value was the source code for the last 40 years of our economy, what is the source code that is required for the next 40? Can we, as a society, consciously design a system that rewards resilience and stability and shared prosperity as richly as Welch's system rewarded ruthless efficiency?
That is the question to sit with. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.